All right, I think this is the most one-sided room I've ever spoken to, so this is good. I can just stay here. This is the Feminist Society's International Men's Day talk on men's issues in the modern world, presented by me, who I haven't put actually my name up there. I'm Mike, and we'll go into that in a bit. So it is indeed International Men's Day on November the 19th. It's been going since 1993 in its current form, and it's to talk about men's issues, essentially, which is what we're going to be doing today. I do have to make a bit of an apology at the beginning. I've been moving house, it feels like forever, but for about the past 3 months since I found out I could do this talk, so parts of this might not be entirely finished, unfortunately, owing to not being in a house. So let's get going. Who am I? I'm a University of Surrey psychology graduate. Well, last time I did this talk, I just walked in and did it. This time I had to be vetted. All my political affiliations looked at, my religious affiliations, so that was great fun. My dissertation was on the effect of gender and masculinity on perceptions of severity and responsibility in intimate partner violence, which is the catchiest title you've ever heard of. But it basically outlines what it was. We were looking at the effect of gender on how people respond to intimate partner violence. It was never published. I never put it out for publication. After it was finished, I looked at the experiment and went, well, that was a bit of a bad idea, wasn't it? So I never published it, but it gave me a lot of background for this kind of talk. I had an article in Inside Man from the last talk, and I was billed as a men's rights activist. I do care a lot about men's rights. That is definitely true, but to me the purpose of rights is to improve your health. That's every kind of right we give people is to make their lives better. So just as really women's rights activism is women's health activism, so do I think men's rights activism is the same as men's health. So I kind of prefer the terms health activist, and I put it in commas because I don't think I merit the name activist enough, to be honest. I do a couple of talks, a couple of YouTube channels, done some fundraisers, but it's not exactly, I'm not jetting around the world trying to solve problems, as it were. So that's me. I'm perhaps not the most qualified person to be talking about this. There are people I know much better, but I'm the one you've got, so enjoy. I have become clickbait at one point. What happened when a male student gave a talk on men's issues to his university's Feminist Society? The result is not what you think, I'm pretty sure was the subtitle to that. So I was clickbait for a while, and a shout out to Ed, who also wrote an article responding to my talk. So the previous talk we did, some responses were, I think, very positive. So I'll just give you a chance to just quickly read them. So I actually met Dan Bell in London a few months after this, and he said, thank you. The article got about 8,000 clicks, and a lot of people were quite positive of the fact that a feminist society had put on an International Men's Day talk. So some responses were a bit less positive. This is an infiltration plan so complex I didn't realise I was doing it. I'm that good at infiltrating men's spheres, I guess. I was actually defended by a MRA I know on YouTube who said, I don't like him, but he's definitely telling the truth, and also here's the video. So at least that one cleared itself up. Okay, before we start, we are going to be talking about domestic violence. We're going to be talking about suicide. We're going to be talking perhaps about rape, and I appreciate those are very sensitive topics for some people. Maybe you know people who've gone through them, you've had experiences yourself. I don't mind if anyone gets up, walks out, stays out, or wants to come back in after a breather. I don't mind. Also, seeing as it is Transgender Awareness Week, I am not going to be covering any kind of trans male issues. Very deliberate oversight. I don't feel qualified, and it would basically make this a very, very long talk. I'd say essentially to you guys, have another talk about them because they're difficult in themselves as well. So, when I did the last talk, I put a request out to all my subscribers on YouTube, on Twitter and on Facebook. So all 2 of them replied and said that they want me to cover this kind of stuff. So bear in mind this is a combination of feminists, men's rights activists, people who don't care for either label, etc., etc. What I'll do, so these were the ones I didn't pick, and we can put them up at the end and have a bit of discussion as well, okay? Last time we covered male victims of rape and sexual assault. We're not doing it this time. Male victims of domestic abuse, which I kept on calling domestic violence, but someone I worked with reminded me that that's not the correct term because violence implies physical, abuse implies more mental as well. Men's depression and suicide, and the idea of a men's liberation movement. And the talk is on YouTube if anyone wants to watch it, if you're not bored of me talking for this one. And today we will be covering stereotypes of men, which could perhaps be a bit more fun and involved. Male victims of domestic abuse, men's depression and suicide, because it is Mental Health Week as well, I believe. Yep, so people wanted me to talk about this as well. And men's education, which we also didn't cover last time, and quite interesting being in a university setting when it gets to that. And finally, what we can do, as in what you can do, what I can do, what society can do.
Can I just open the door?
Yes, good, please, it's boiling. Yeah, that's why I took my jacket off. I felt rude asking. You give me a room and it's too hot. Yay. Right. Okay. Stereotypes of men. I did put post-it notes down on everyone's table. Can you make sure everyone's got some, please? Because we're... Right, whilst you're handing them out, I'll explain. We're going to do an activity to start off with. Everyone groans. What I want you to do, on the post-it note, write down what you think is the worst stereotype you personally hold about men and the best stereotype that you think is a good stereotype. And to make sure you feel like you can be honest, once you've written it, can you pass it around each other so you don't know who's you're reading?
We're each doing it individually.
Yeah, do it all individually, then pass it around each other. Just so you can be honest, basically.
So the positive and negative.
Worst stereotype you think you have of men and the best stereotype you think you have of men. So, yeah, it doesn't matter. Or if you can't call them best or worst, just write down 2 stereotypes you think you have. Pass them back, pass them forward, left to right. I won't look, so I won't know whose is whose. Don't worry, I'm not going to judge anyone, so just write anything down. If you're really, really stuck, think of one your friend has. Pass it round, mix them up. Yeah, try not to end up back with your own.
There you go.
If you haven't got one, then don't write it down. But some good shuffling going on. Right, let's get started. You at the front. Want to read yours out?
Okay. They said best, men don't waffle too much.
Men don't waffle.
Yeah. Don't feel the need to offload onto other people.
I'm going to run out of whiteboard space. Offload. Okay. The bad one.
They're more likely to be players.
More likely to be players. Okay. Someone else, quickly. Pick amongst yourselves.
Aggressive.
Aggressive. Another one.
Emotionally muted.
Emotionally neutered. Can
Less
people read this? Sorry, I've got really bad handwriting. Should have got someone else. I should have gone through my threat and asked you to do it. Emotionally neutered.
Less responsible and don't care about stuff.
Irresponsible or less responsible.
Yeah.
Was that one of the good ones? Irresponsible?
No. It says less responsible, bad stereotype, and then don't care about stuff, also bad.
Okay. Okay, another one.
More likely to try or experiment with drugs.
Okay. I'm going to put risk-taking drugs, just to summarise that. Interesting.
Linking to that, less likely to accept responsibility.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
Resilient.
Oh yeah, accept responsibility.
Resilient, did I hear?
Yeah.
Cool.
Privileged.
Privileged. How do I spell that? There you
D.
go. What did I say, sorry?
L-E-D-G.
I think.
We know what it means. Anyone else?
Men are unaware of their own privilege and do not care for the poor treatment of others.
Unaware. Cool.
Decisive and strong.
Decisive. Unfortunately, I am short, so I can't really fit it in. Decisive and strong.
A man following you down the alleyway has the intention of harming you, so predatory.
Predatory, yeah, I'll summarise that. Predatory.
Smart.
Smart. Okay, I think we're pretty good. All right, so that's kind of ours as a room. Maybe you don't necessarily hold it, but you wrote it down. That's ours as a room. Let's look at what psychology research has to say, basically. And I've got one study that I really like. It says that men are bad, but bold. And this is actually quite common. Quite a common perception. Men are bad, they are predatory, risk-taking with drugs, unaware of their privileges, don't care, irresponsible, but they are also decisive, they're also strong. This is a stereotype we actually see quite a lot. But male stereotypes are also kind of weird in that basically what you find in terms of stereotypes when you've got dominant groups and less dominant groups, and this is quite common, for instance, in racism, the less dominant group tends to have positive stereotypes about the dominant group. They'll have some negative ones as well, but they also tend to have a lot of positive ones. It's kind of weird kind of looking up kind of thing. Some of it's viewed as system justification, as in they're up there, so there must be a reason they're up there. Men are the exception, even though if you read a lot of literature, obviously feminist society, a lot of feminist theory, men are the dominant group, they actually tend to be viewed less positively than women, which is strange for a dominant group. Is it because the status quo of men as the dominant group has been challenged so much? Or is it because of, we'll get on to benevolent and hostile attitudes, the fact they're correlated? I'm going to leave that question open to you, essentially, to look into more. And we got benevolent and hostile attitudes. Benevolent attitudes are still stereotypes. They're still what I would call sexist, but they're kind of nice as well. So I think one used in this study was every woman should have a man she should look up to. Men are more likely to put themselves in danger for others, heroic, protective. But you see how that can also be a problem in that it constrains people to a role. And hostile attitudes are things like men are predatory, men don't care, men, I'm trying to think of the ones that came from the study, basically negative stereotypes, and again those also constrain people as well. Also when you put, does anyone know about stereotype models? There's one which has warmth and competence. So if people are high competence and high warmth, we like them a lot. If they're low warmth but high competence, they kind of evoke jealousy. Low competence, low warmth is kind of disgust. And low competence, high warmth, which seems to be where people put old people, they tend to evoke sympathy and pity. And men are high competence but low warmth, so jealousy and kind of cold emotions, but also kind of thinking that they're good at things as well. And it's summarised as the paper says, men are bad but bold and women are wonderful but weaker. So this is the kind of stereotype we generally see. Some good news, if you are a non-traditionalist person like me who likes progressive values. I'm sure some people would disagree this is good news, but I think it's good. I've said that benevolence towards men is system justifying. You know, it may seem nice, but it also constrains men into roles, like the hero, the protector, and the other negative roles, the predator. But as gender equality in a country increases, benevolence towards men decreases, which is a sentence which doesn't look good, but is good. And also as gender equality increases, hostility towards men decreases. Same effect with women, by the way, so this is pretty universal. The more gender equal a country becomes, the more both of these kind of stereotypes go down. So basically, the less people endorse traditional views, the less they are benevolent and the less they are hostile. Now, one that came up, I think, did it come up? Yeah, aggressive. Aggressive is quite interesting. It's also partly my dissertation, hence why I know a bit more about it. You probably might think men being aggressive is a stereotype a lot of people hold. It's come up here. What's quite interesting is when you run experiments and you have an aggressive action done by a man or a woman, the results are either null or inconclusive. You know, there's a bit of debate in the literature. So we're actually not sure if people perceive men or women as more aggressive depending on their act. Some of it might be down to women are meant to be aggressive, so the shock of an aggressive act is greater, or yeah, we don't know basically. Weapon focus, and I love this study, is affected by gender. So does anyone know weapon focus? No? Okay. Imagine there's a situation and you've got to memorize my face. And I burst into the room, and I burst into the room holding this microphone that I've been using, or I burst into the room holding a gun. You're more likely to remember my face if I'm holding the microphone than the gun because you're going to focus on the gun. They did this study with a knife or a knitting needle and a man or a woman. And they found that when a woman comes at you with a knitting needle, you remember her face more than if she comes at you with a knife. But when it was with men, people actually focused on the knitting needle more than the knife. So people remembered men's face worse when he's holding a knitting needle. I don't know what that says about us as people. I just found it a brilliant study, the fact that someone thought of putting a knitting needle in there. And there is one very important exception to this aggression kind of gender parity, and we will come to that in a bit. Okay. When I said I was going to do this talk, someone asked me to talk about toxic/hegemonic masculinity. I studied psychology. This is a very gender studies sociology term, so I'm not as confident with it. In psychology, we don't tend to look at big societal influences. So I looked up nice and quick for you guys, and also I want to say a bit about it as well at the end. So we'll quickly go through it as much as I know. So the idea is that basically men are at the top of the hierarchy and they want to maintain that position. And it's kind of the masculine man who's at the top of that hierarchy. And what they do to maintain that is subordinate women and non-masculine men, any man who doesn't fit the ideal of this powerful man. And it leads to policing of masculinity by society. If you're a man, you have to act like this, and that's policed by both women and men. I think one of the best examples I can think of women policing masculinity is World War I. with the white feathers in the caps, you don't go off to a war. It was actually women who pressured men to go into war. Yeah, the politicians said go, the women pressured the men to go. And it emphasises competition, stoicism, aggression, violence and risk-taking, things we've kind of talked about. Basically, you need to be Rambo. Good film. But just like Rambo, it's a complete fantasy. No man will ever reach this ideal, hence why it's called toxic. And it also constrains things, like men are supposed to be stoic. Okay, what if you're depressed and you need to talk about your issues? It contradicts. What if you're like me, you're 5'8" and barely weigh anything? You know, I don't fit the masculine ideal. I'm supposed to have problems in society, essentially. So no one can reach it, and that's a bad thing. I wanted to bring this up, one, because someone asked me to talk about it, but also a word of warning. So, first of all, stereotypes. We all have stereotypes. I don't ever trust anyone who says they don't have stereotypes. The question is what we do with them, how we seek to think about them, how we seek to counteract them. And you can make a lot of money by running implicit bias courses at all kinds of universities and stuff. Trust me, I've been on them. But we just need to make sure that we deal with them. The other thing is be careful where you put blame and responsibility. And this is why I want to talk about toxic masculinity. Because there is a perception, right or wrong, that when people mention it, what they're trying to do is put all the blame for men's problems on men. I sometimes see this happening, sometimes people aren't, sometimes people are when they mention toxic masculinity. Not everyone who writes an article talking about men's issues is the same person. But be careful that when we talk about men's issues, and perhaps we talk about maybe men not wanting to talk about their emotions, men not wanting to open up, that we're not just trying to blame men for them. We've got to look at women's influence as well, and just society in general, you know, the way that society builds itself up regardless of the genders involved. We also need to look at those as well. So that's just a word of warning. All right? So that is stereotypes. Now, hopefully you've had a bit of fun with that, because it's about to get a bit more difficult with male victims of domestic abuse. So just a straw poll. In terms of percentage of domestic abuse cases, what percent do you think are men? No wrong answers.
So how many are reported, or how many
Actual. Let's go for actual.
25?
25%? 30%? 50%? Okay. Anyone else?
5%?
35?
Yes.
Yep. Anyone else? Anyone thinks it's higher than our top band of 50? With lowest we got was 25. Anyone think it's lower than 25? Okay. Maybe the campaigns have been doing their good. Excellent. So, according to the Mankind Initiative, Mankind Initiative is one of the few charities in the UK set up solely to help male victims of domestic abuse. I know a couple of others like Gender Free DV, which is basically for everyone. And they, in the report that I read when I made this last year, unfortunately, it was 1 in 3 victims of domestic violence and intimate partner violence in the UK are men. They've since updated that to 2 out of 5, which I think was closer to the numbers they got anyway, because I always had a problem with the kind of 1 in 3, in that when you worked out what they'd done, it came closer to 44%. So I was really confused why they did this, but they've updated it. 14.7% of men have been victims of domestic abuse since they were 16. 10.9% of men have been victims of partner abuse since they were 16. So domestic abuse can include by the family, whereas partner abuse is a partner. So almost 750,000 men, 4.5% of the UK population, were estimated to have experienced domestic abuse in 2013-14, and 500,000 men suffered partner abuse. It affects about 6.2% of gay and bisexual men. Unfortunately, gay and bisexual, it didn't say whether they were in a same-sex relationship. It looked at them rather than the relationship, if I remember correctly, compared to 3.3% of heterosexual men. And just for comparison, 12.4% of lesbian and bisexual women suffered intimate partner violence compared to 4.3% of heterosexual women. This is all from the Mankind Initiative and the Office of National Statistics. They will have released more up-to-date statistics, but this is for 2013-14. And from the numbers I was given, I couldn't get a solid number, but I estimated about 23 men died at the hands of their partner in 2013-14. Most years it's about 30. And it's about, I think it's about 120 women. But, and this is, so that was kind of 33 to 44%, yeah? The Partner Abuse State of Knowledge project, which did take place in America, not the UK, and Canada, I think, said that 19.3% of men are assaulted by a partner, just a partner, at least once in their lifetime. Past year rates were somewhat higher for men than women. So when you asked in the previous year, have you been assaulted by a partner? Slightly higher for men. And they found that female perpetrated violence was higher than male, so more women commit domestic abuse. So it's 28.3% versus 21.6%. And this is where we start to get into the real nitty-gritty. A lot of intimate partner violence is bidirectional. It's both people have expressed some level of violence to each other. Some of it's, one person may be expressing more, but both are. And that's about 57.9% of the cases in this study. 13.8% of the unidirectional violence was male to female, and 28.3% was female to male. As you can probably tell from the fact that I've just given you two sets of very different numbers, this is a very difficult topic to investigate. As I said, I did it for my dissertation. Trying to find a solid number that I could just put down was very, very difficult. It depends on where you're getting your sample from. It depends on what kind of survey you're using. There's one family of surveys that tend to always come out about 50-50 and one that comes out very heavily biased towards men being perpetrators. It depends on time frame as well, so it's quite a difficult thing to investigate. And the other thing, among school and college samples, the percentage of bidirectional violence was 51.9%, 16% male on female, and 31% female on male, and also rates are slightly higher amongst young people. Yeah?
How did they define violence in this experiment?
That's the other thing. How do you define violence? So the different families of tests that are done tend to define it slightly differently. Some, and this is a criticism of a lot of the scales that I was using for my dissertation, for instance, is that the criticism is that they ignore the context of violence. Because some people argue that to talk about intimate partner violence, you have to talk about systematic campaigns of control and abuse. Others argue that any violence between partners, that gets physical or mentally manipulative, should come under it. Some take into account alcohol, mental health, some don't. As far as I know, the Partner Abuse State of Knowledge project did use a lot of conflicts tactics scale studies, which tend to look at have you been hit or did you hit your partner in the past year, I think, and related things like that, so single acts. It's difficult, you're right. How do we define domestic abuse? How do you define intimate partner violence? How do you define control? And that could be a whole 2-hour presentation in itself, so I thought I'd just give you a rough overview. The last one is how the Office of National Statistics defines it, and generally I tend to go with government ways of looking at things. Does that kind of half answer your question? A little bit, yeah. It's very, very difficult topic to study. What help is there? So again, according to the Mankind Initiative, there are 17 spaces for male victims of domestic violence in the UK, 63 for either gender across 12 organisations. Although I think in the previous year there has been a push to kind of not make male spaces, but make more spaces like co-ed. I don't know how far that got, but I know that push was happening. There are 4,000 spaces for female victims of domestic violence and their children across 400 organisations. That's still not enough. I contacted Women's Aid a while ago, and they sent me a report which said essentially, according to the European research group, sorry, I've forgotten the exact name, we need about 10,000 spaces for women. So when you think, even if we take the lower bound of male victims and make the assumption that they're going to need the same services, which they may not do, we need about 3,000 spaces for men and about 10,000 spaces for women, roughly. So they have 0.5% of the dedicated spaces, men. For every one male space, there were 43,000 male victims, and for every one female space, there were about 3,500 female victims. Just a little caveat, not everyone who suffers domestic abuse is going to need a space at a refuge. I'm just kind of working on the assumption that the male and female victims will need them about roughly the same rate. But not everyone who suffers domestic abuse will need a space, especially considering, as we were saying, sometimes it's just one instance of violence and people can get past that. Sometimes that is enough though. So, and sometimes men have to turn down refuges or shelters because they're just too far away. There's not many of them, it's hard to find them. Or they're turned away from shelters. This is probably only going to get worse because funding for shelters in general is being cut by all kinds of means. Generally by taking away certain benefits that shelters get and people sending less money to them. So this problem currently is only getting worse, I'm afraid. Down to one commentator I saw worrying that basically all shelters are going to close. Okay, and the Mankind Initiative funding. So the Mankind Initiative receives no government funding. Little asterisk, I talked to the head of the Mankind Initiative. He's a bit iffy about taking government funding if they did provide it, because you then kind of have to work how the government wants you to, and it's kind of questionable whether they would support it in the way that he wants to. I don't fully agree with him. You're allowed to disagree. I personally would just take the funding and go, but whatever. Additional revenue, and had revenue of 50,000. Refuge, which supports women and children in partnership with Women's Aid, receive 11 million in government funding. For male rape victims, actually, there was an initiative a while ago which worked with Survivors UK, which did provide £1 million of government funding for supporting male rape victims. So it's not that the government never funds these, it's just that it's not always as much and it's kind of hard to get it, basically. So Mankind received a lot less funding than Refuge, basically. Well, of course, pointing out, neither of these are the only charities, they were just the ones I picked out because they're the most visible. Conviction rates, they have been going up, which is good, going up for everyone, basically. So 3,700 in 2013-14, up from 806 in 2004-2005 for female perpetrators, and 54,000 compared to 18,500 for men. And you see basically there's slightly lower conviction rates for women than men. And only 27% of domestic abuse cases go to court. Not all of them will need to go to court, depending on how you define it. Sometimes people don't want to support because it was a one-off, or people don't want to support because they're in a very bad situation, they basically are terrified. You don't know, basically just by looking at numbers. So, another why. Why do you think, despite having about 33% to maybe 50% of the victims, we put less funding, less resources into supporting male victims of domestic abuse?
It probably stems from stereotyping.
Mm-hmm.
We perceive that there's probably a perception that male rape cases and male domestic abuse cases just don't happen.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's quite a prevalent mindset, that it just doesn't happen, that because there is the stereotype that men are stronger or more capable, that they wouldn't be in that situation. And also the stereotypes on women, that women are weak, inherently weaker than men, that they wouldn't be in that situation either.
Yep. Anyone else? Back.
I think one of the problems is that when a woman is abused, it's usually done in the form of physical violence, i.e. beating up. So in a court of law, it's very clear cut what the abuse is. Whereas in the case of a man being abused, it's usually in the form of verbal abuse, which goes on for a very, very long time, and it's extremely difficult to tell whether it is abuse or is not. And usually the man doesn't confide in it with other people, or seek help from someone else, and just shrugs it off, or just takes it on the chin and just puts up with it until in the end his patience explodes and he lashes out, and he's the one who's convicted for making the first move physically.
Interestingly, the kind of levels of physical violence are about equal.
Really?
From the research that I've done, they're actually about equal. Often we find perhaps women are slightly more aggressive, commit more physical acts, 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points kind of in it. One of the most prevalent ways that men commit domestic abuse actually happens to be stalking, according to the ONS anyway. That was one of the most prevalent ones. So, yeah. Anyone else? Go for it.
Problem of, like, when you get a movement around an issue, like domestic abuse, or in the sense of domestic abuse on females, once you start building a movement, then there are more people likely to join the movement rather than create a new movement. So if you care about the issue of domestic violence, you'll probably go, oh, so there's these big organizations that help domestic violence victims, I'll just help them, instead of looking at what is the most I can do.
So you're kind of like an inertia kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So once the movement gets going, it's much easier to get more people and more funding, then consequently, because you have more people and you're doing more, and then there's this nudge that goes to the other side.
Yeah, interesting idea.
A lack of recognisable faces, because very often when it comes to reports that are done, or places where the government's asking people to come and present research, etc., they'll get survivors who come in and give their first-hand experience to inform the decisions that occur. But when it comes to male victims of domestic abuse, there might be extra societal pressures like toxic masculinity, which keep them back. For example, they may be targeted by other men for being weak, or in this sort of thing. So.
Okay. Anyone else got any ideas? Okay. Right. This is the part of the talk which I have to be quite critical of feminist academics of the late 70s, 80s and early 90s and onwards, I'm afraid. But this talk is very carefully structured, so I'm going to criticise feminists for a while, and then we're all going to be friends by the end of it, hopefully. Hopefully. Because we do need to talk about this, because it's important. It's part of the puzzle, and this is a very, very complicated puzzle, and we're not going to answer it today. So, we have suppression of academic research into male victims of domestic abuse, that should say, attempting to silence campaigners and those who raise awareness, lack of male representation on domestic abuse boards, reluctance of victims to come forward, social stigmas and stereotypes, and these all influence each other. And you can probably find more. These are just the ones that I've picked out because I haven't got overly long. Suppression of data. So there was a feminist theory, explicitly feminist theory, of domestic abuse that focused on power relations. Basically, the idea is men have the power in society, men want to maintain the power. One way they maintain the power is by domestic abuse. You also see feminist theories of rape, for instance, that have a very similar vein. Having that theory, and then having 44 to 55% of domestic abuse victims being male, doesn't work very well. It jars, essentially. And when you reach that point where you've got this paradigm and it's not really fitting with the data, you have two options, basically. As a field, you can abandon the paradigm, which maybe you should do, or you can keep trying to go on with the paradigm, and then you need to start doing things to get rid of the pesky data. It's known as paradigm resistance, and it happens all the time in all kinds of fields. My personal favourite one is in nutrition science, for instance, because there's actually a lot of evidence out there that sugar's pretty bad for you. Cholesterol maybe isn't so bad for you. You know, fatty meat maybe not so bad for you. I like it because it means I can eat steak more. So Professor Murray Strauss, he's quite old now. He was going through the 70s, 80s, 90s. Himself a feminist, lists 7 methods by which this was done. And we can't go through all of them, but suppress evidence. Evidence comes along, you don't like it, don't let it get published. Avoid obtaining inconsistent data. Very easy to do. I want to sample how many women have been assaulted. Fine, I'll go to a shelter. I want to sample why men are aggressive in domestic violence. Fine, I'll go to a rehab thing for male perpetrators of domestic abuse. Very easy to do by accident as well in a lot of studies. Cite-only studies that show male perpetration. So there's a load of studies. I'm just going to pick the ones that confirm with my theory. Again, easy to do, any kind of science. Conclude results support the paradigm, the feminist paradigm. When they don't, what one was that? There was one I read which was particularly bad. Basically found roughly equal perpetration rates between men and women. Their conclusion was that we need to find out why women are defending themselves. No similar conclusion, why do we need to find out that men are defending themselves? Following on from this paradigm makes perfect sense, but when you actually looked at their raw data, didn't really support what they were saying. Create evidence by citation. This is known as the Woozle effect, I think. And it's basically, everyone just keeps citing the study, but no one actually reads it. So everyone thinks it says this, but it doesn't. Obstruct publication and funding of research, that would contradict the paradigm. You know, you're on a board, you support this feminist paradigm, you're divvying out funding. This one will support it, this one won't. We'll put a bit more funding that way. And the worst one, harass, threaten and penalise researchers. So we're talking blacklisting, we're talking shouting down, saying you'll never... I think Murray Strauss reports that he had a doctorate student who was told that she'd never work if she works with Professor Strauss. Attempts to silent campaigners. I'm going to use Erin Pizzey as an example. You don't have to agree with her, you don't have to agree with her research, you don't have to agree with anything, but this is what happened to her, for instance. So she started Refuge, starts the first refuges, and she says, from her experience in the refuges, that women can be equally violent to men. And she writes a book called Prone to Violence with another researcher. There was a protest at this book. Bearing in mind this is in the 70s, so this is when the domestic abuse movement is starting as well. She needed a police escort between things because people were harassing her. She received bomb threats, so a bomb squad had to check her letters, and she's no longer recognised by Refuge. They just disavow her altogether. Some people say that it was feminists who killed her dog. No, as far as I can tell, it was a racist group that killed her dog. She had quite a large multiracial family. That's as far as I could find. So if anyone says that they killed her dog, that's not necessarily true. Lack of male representation. This one came to my attention recently with Graham Leadbitter. So Graham Leadbitter is part of a domestic abuse charity. He's on the board. He's taken the White Ribbon Pledge, which we'll talk about in a second. And he's really, really committed to stopping violence against women. Unfortunately, he's a man. And the Scottish Women's Aid Association says your boards have to be all female. So the Scottish Women's Aid group said, either get rid of Graham or leave. And the group left. They kept Graham, saying it doesn't matter whether you have a beard or not, which I thought was a great line. But this looks at a bigger problem of a lot of the domestic abuse research, a lot of the domestic abuse sector, if you will, is women. And you're probably not going to go into it if you are yourself abusing people. You're going to be if you care about it or if you are a victim. So there's a distortion going on there with people's experiences in this sector. Let's also talk about the White Ribbon Pledge. It's on the November the 25th, which is for men to take to say that I will never commit, condone, or remain silent about violence by men against women. We don't have any kind of equivalent for violence against men. So again, we're reinforcing this message that it's male on female all the time. Reluctance of victims to come forward. So statistically, true. 29% of male victims never tell anyone. For women, it's 17%. 10% of male victims tell the police. Women, it's 27%, which again leads to distortion down the line. If you're looking at police statistics, you'll find hardly any men in them, even though we've got the other research. Only 10% will tell a health professional, and only 22% will tell someone in a professional position. It's higher for women all the time. Lack of high-profile cases. When I was making this a year ago, all I could think was Ian McNichol. Does anyone know him? Hands up. He's the most widely known case I could think of, and you guys don't know him. He was beaten up by his wife. She poured a kettle down his back. He ended up homeless for, I think, 18 months. Yep, because I wrote it there. Oh, no, I didn't. He ended up homeless for about 18 months, and she racked up large credit card bills in his name as well, so he ended up penniless as well. He appeared in the Telegraph, kind of saying his story, and he got a bit of attention for that. Stereotypes and stigma. There's a lot of reasons for not leaving an abusive relationship. As far as I know, a lot of these are very similar for why women don't leave abusive relationships. Concerns about the children, marriage for life, love, the fear of never seeing the children again, which is a big fear for men, because we don't have time to talk about it, but the courts are slightly biased towards, or very biased, depending who you ask, towards women custody, and thinking that she'll change. Poster campaigns only tend to feature female victims. When I did this last year, someone said the campaign in the Lose has 2 women and a man. Great. And then I saw it, and it's the man covering his eyes because he's ignoring the violence, not because he's a victim, or it could go either way. And they just don't fit our stereotypes. They literally don't fit our stereotypes because we've run experiments on this, and I did as well. So I know this area a fair amount. So DV is the exception I was talking about. In the aggression literature, there's a big gender difference between male and female. Male on female violence is seen as very aggressive. Female on male, not so much. They attribute more responsibility to male victims of domestic violence, i.e. the victim must have done something to deserve it. And they see it as less severe, so he's not going to be as harmed. I found this in my dissertation as well, and every study I could find found basically the same thing. And the only thing is the perpetrator is always seen as more responsible than the victim. Yeah, it's never the case that the victim always is just more responsible because he's a man. It's just that it's less. They tend to view the male victim as having more responsibility than female. There is some hope. So more research is being done. I could find more and more the more I looked at things for my dissertation. And the paradigm which ignored them seems to be falling out of fashion because it doesn't work very well, and it also ignores other things like mental health and alcohol. I went to a conference, which was one of the first conferences in a while, about the relationship between alcohol and domestic abuse, which, I don't know about you, but I always thought that they would be related whatsoever. Yeah, they'll always be related. They're becoming more salient in the public eye. Clare's Law is available to everyone. If you think your partner has a history, you can look it up. Look up Clare's Law so you know exactly how to do it, but you can do that. And as a whole, domestic violence is actually going down. As a society, we are becoming less violent. And we are reporting more, so that's kind of a good thing. Right. Men's depression and suicide. Does everyone roughly know what... Oh, sorry, that rounds up domestic abuse. Going to move on to men's depression and suicide now. Does everyone know roughly what depression is? Got a rough idea in your head? You can refresh yourself on there. I'm not going to read it out. Okay. Right to go on, yeah? Cool. So, 1 in 10 men will seek treatment for depression in their lifetime. It's kind of thrown around the idea that men with depression are more likely to be irritable, have sudden bursts of anger, increased loss of control. So the idea there is that maybe it's getting misattributed as antisocial behaviour disorder. and engage in greater risk-taking and aggression. But I've also seen some studies which say actually men's depression is completely the same. There's no difference between men and women. It's all the same. And men can suffer different kinds of depression, including postpartum depression. Even though they're not the one giving birth, the situation has changed. There's a whole different lifestyle for them, so they can suffer postpartum depression, even though that was one maybe you'd think, even if you weren't very biased, just think maybe only women suffer that one. And also, being this, I've combined the two, depression isn't necessarily always a good predictor of suicidal behaviour. It's definitely a predictor, but just because someone's depressed doesn't mean they can commit suicide. Just because someone commits suicide doesn't mean they are depressed. I just thought I'd definitely clear that up. According to CALM, the Campaign Against Living Miserably, in 2014, 46,023 men took their own life, and 76% of all suicides are men. It's 1 man every 2 hours, 12 men every day. It's the most common cause of death for men under 45. 41% of men have contemplated suicide. 42%, and 41% who said it didn't think they could talk about their feelings, and 32% just didn't want people to worry about them. I don't know what the comparative statistics are for women, I'm afraid, so that's just how it's going to have to stand. So why again? Why do we think that men commit suicide more, don't seek depression, help for depression as much? Any ideas?
I think that when men get depressed, even if they have a loving family who's willing to spend time and emotional energy talking through their problems, for the men it doesn't console them or comforting so much. And they feel that after the discussion is over and finished, their problems are still there waiting for them and nothing has changed. And I also think that they're unwilling to seek professional help in the form of a doctor or a counsellor for almost the same reasons. They know that no amount of psychotherapy or even medication will actually make their problems go away. Only them as an individual can solve that. And if they genuinely and utterly can't find an answer to the puzzle, then they feel that they've got no alternative but to end it now, just to put them out of their misery.
Okay, anyone else? Any ideas from here? You don't have to, I'm not going to make you talk. It's quite a sensitive topic, I understand. Okay, one thing might be, like we were talking about earlier, gender policing, the idea that you can't talk about depression because it's not masculine, it's not manly. Or is it that we've got inherent problems in how men's depression is treated? We've got contradictory evidence. Is it kind of unique from women's depression? Is it the same? Maybe we've got some problems going on there. I went to a talk quite a while ago now by a guest lecturer here who was saying that he found when he talked to therapists dealing with men's depression, they wanted the woman in their life to get involved and to help them through it because women are seen as supportive. There's a lot of problems going on there. What if you're single? What if you are gay? What if she's not very supportive, because not all women are supportive, funnily enough. There's huge problems there. Why anyone thought that was a good idea, I don't know. Lack of accessing mental health, and so either not going for it or not finding it, only going to get worse because the mental health sector in this country is kind of decreasing as well. Or is it the environment? Automation and the recession have affected male-dominated jobs more than female-dominated jobs. And I think there's like a list of jobs that are going to disappear through automation, and most of them are male-dominated. Or is it the fact that more fathers lose their children in court cases than mothers, and that's known to be a predictor of suicide as well? It's something to look into as well when, if you do psychology or sociology, it's something for you to look into. I quite like this campaign that went on, trying to get men to talk about their issues. The Man Dictionary campaign I always quite like, but it's not just about men not talking. And we're talking about gender policing. Social roles are pretty strong, yeah? When you're an older man, I'm a young man, I can kind of change my social roles. I've grown up in a slightly more equal in society. Older men aren't going to have that. You need to try and deal with their depression in a way that talks to their perhaps more traditional view of masculinity, which is why I love men's sheds as an idea. Men's sheds are basically things set up, workshops, benches. You can do manly things like making things. And it's for older men to get to know other men, deal with the loneliness that can come with older age sometimes. Maybe talk about their problems, but mostly just spend time with each other, which I love as an idea, because there's no point, or maybe there's limited point, in trying to force people to change their views of masculinity, for instance, when they're perhaps a bit older. Some can. I just think you also need to take into account people's original views. Yep, that's still more from Calm, more adverts that were going out when I made this presentation, so these are about a year old now. And Movember has kind of changed its perspective this year to talk about male suicide. I would take part if I could actually grow any kind of facial hair whatsoever. It was awful. I tried it in first year, it did not end well. So they're talking about it as well, and hopefully they get out there, because all of you kind of smiled when I put Movember. You know Movember, right? So hopefully that'll get it out there as well. Okay, got a bit of time. Educating men and boys. This is the last one we're going to talk about. I haven't put a why, but when we talk about gender and education, first name that comes to your head. Or no names. Anyone can think of anyone when I talk about education and gender, women or men?
Malala Yousafzai.
Thank you. I wasn't going to say it. I wanted someone else to do it. A woman seeking women's education. When we talk about education, we don't think, or tend to think, about how men suffer, mostly because it's not very obvious. In her case, women are actively being denied their education by men with guns, No men with guns, or women with guns if you want, are trying to deny men their education. That's, as far as I know, not happening anywhere. Okay, slight change to that. Some groups think that men should follow a very religious education and deny them all other kinds of education. And in those groups, you tend to actually find that women have better education than men. But that's one exception. It's not quite a big one. So what I'm going to talk about isn't going to be men or women with guns stopping boys getting their education. It's going to be more subtle than that. We're also going to be starting at the end. We're going to be starting where we are now, where I've got to and gone through, university, because a lot of research tends to view it as the be-all and end-all of education. Education was a success if you went to university. I happen to disagree with this, but I'm going to use it because it makes things quite neat and tidy for us to talk about, just as a kind of starter way of looking at this. So I'm going to be using the Boys to Men report, which is a HEPI report by Hillman and Robinson. So, there are 123 large higher education institutions in the UK, 500 plus students. How many do you think have more men than women? You can give it as a percent, because I don't mind. More men than women. 5%, okay. Or I can change, you can...
Is that specifically in the UK?
Yeah, this is in the UK.
Yeah, I'd say between 5 and 10%.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mean as students or
Students, yeah.
2%.
2%? Do you think that's a big difference?
30%.
3%. Okay, but what if I put it the other way? How many do you think have more women than men? And do you think that's do you think it'll be a big difference or just a little one, we're talking 51 to 49% kind of thing?
And I've read statistics that say that generally in the UK, women are educated to a further extent. Women are more likely to further their education to university level.
Yep. I've got a very educated audience, I quite like it, although it does ruin all the shock factor.
Sorry.
So, In how many countries, this is OECD countries, by the way, so a very specific set of mostly Western Europe, Australia, America, a couple of others. Do you think women outperform men in terms of entering tertiary education? All of them, half of them, none of them? Just stab in the dark.
Absolutely most.
You think most? More women entering?
Like 50%?
50%? Any idea?
Similar.
Similar, 50%? All right, cool. Someone said 60. I heard 60. Right, 26 of the 123 large higher education institutions have more men than women. So turn around, about, what was that, 97 out of 123 have more women than men. Oxford and Cambridge, 46% of the undergraduates are women. But they're kind of the exception, because even amongst the higher tariff universities, women are 28% more likely to enter at the age of 18. Oxford and Cambridge have a bit of a reputation of being perhaps a bit elitist, a bit set in their ways, sexist, basically. But even when we take into account the prestigious universities, the higher ones, there's still more women entering than men. And men 18 plus are also more likely to drop out of university. For OECD countries, including Saudi Arabia, which isn't an OECD country as far as I know, but okay, it's up there, more women enter tertiary education than men in all of them, apart from Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Switzerland, and 54% of entrants in OECD countries are women. So slightly more. I think if you take out places where there's actual barriers, it would go up. But okay. It's not a simple picture. As with everything I've said so far, it is nowhere near simple. For instance, class and ethnicity affect it a lot as well. The most disadvantaged white male is 5 times less likely to enter tertiary education than the most advantaged white male. Okay? And if we split it by quite a rough measure of free school meals, so if you're on free school meals, you're in one group. If you're not on free school meals, you're in another group, which I'm aware takes into account pretty much everyone from not quite, in poverty to super rich, but that's the divide that's quite useful. 8.9% of 18-year-old white men on free school meals enter tertiary education. 43.8% of 18-year-old Asian women not on free school meals enter tertiary education. So they're the highest achieving group. So it looks a bit like this. So the worst off in a lot of education studies in the UK tend to be poor white men, going up to the best off being Asian females. Didn't want to leave that up. Okay. Yeah, a bit of a rough measure, dividing it by free school meals, but it's the one that they used. Can you think of any reasons why this might be? Any thoughts at all? Go on. Out the back.
Could be alternatives to university as a higher education, so apprenticeships, those sorts of things, or taking on my father's plumbing business or electrician business, that sort of thing.
That's kind of why I don't like university as a measure, but we'll come to that in a second. Actually, anyone else?
Usually, people with more money have better opportunities when they're growing up.
Yeah. It explains the class divide, but doesn't explain the gender divide. Anyone else?
Often girls are pushed to go to university in a way, maybe because previously in certain countries women were unable to get an education. Now that it is accessible, I think we're pushed more to go towards it and to strive for it, I guess.
Kind of, we fought for you to have this right, so
Yeah,
please use it.
Yeah, utilise it.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
There,
Oh, sorry.
there are more male-dominated jobs that are available after graduation from college. So if there's a job that's very male-dominated, that there are more jobs male-dominated that require college, and more female-dominated roles that require higher education, then you're more likely to fit into that.
Okay, so those are ideas, yeah? Our ideas. We don't know for sure. This is, again, really complicated, and a lot of people have their own ideas and their own views. The gap disappears once we account for GCSEs. It's one of the surefire ways of kind of wiping out the gap is to account for GCSEs, which then raises a really big question of, well, why are boys' GCSEs lower? And we'll get onto that in a second. The other big thing, nursing now requires a degree, so the idea of different jobs, it doesn't account for all of it. The gap decreases if you include nursing. It actually takes out quite a big chunk of that gap, but it doesn't go away altogether, so it can't be the whole picture, but it is definitely part of it. Another argument is that higher education has more financial benefits for women. A non-university educated woman is going to make a lot less than a university educated woman, whereas a man, maybe they're closer together. How much an 18-year-old thinks about that at the time or is really aware of that, I don't know. I wasn't, but maybe everyone's a bit more on the ball than me, I don't know. One big thing that always comes up is, do we need more male teachers? The HEPI report actually said no. And the author is a big advocate of we need more male teachers, but the report he made, and he admitted it, says actually no. The idea basically is that everyone has a bit of an in-group bias, so female teachers like female students more, and male teachers male students more. They actually not necessarily found evidence of that, not consistently anyway, and some have even found that male teachers maybe are harsher on boys, but again, inconsistent. Is there a lack of attempts to get men and boys in tertiary education? Apart from teacher training, only 2 institutions have kind of quotas to get men and boys into tertiary education. The teacher training, it tends to be a bit more, again, because we kind of feel like we need male teachers. And maybe it's negative press about men in education, things like lad culture. That gets brought up a lot. Maybe it turns men off universities. So here we go. It's not just coming from a very female-dominated course myself, psychology, but, you know, history and philosophy are roughly equal, which was often seen as the stuffy man project. Subjects allied to medicine include nursing, so that's why we've got, is it down to nursing? It's a big chunk, but not necessarily all of it, and we've got hardly any women in engineering. Engineer? Yeah. So some of this, anyone surprised at the differences in these courses, or are these roughly what you expect from, well, I'm sure you just looking around your room can work out this one.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
So.
And me looking around, I don't know where, social studies, I guess I'd be under, or biological sciences. Yeah, I was one of, 10 men in a room of 90 people. Okay. So why are boys' results lower at GCSE? Why is this the case? Well, again, we don't know, but we have found boys play more video games and read less. So the answer to all of this is obviously you girls all need to start playing video games more, and I'm sure no one will ever have a problem with that. Boys spend an hour less on homework per week. Boys are less likely to be intrinsically motivated by schoolwork, and boys are more likely to have a negative attitude about school. But why all these? Yeah, this just raises more questions. We can't just stop at, boys don't like school. That's not an answer. That's the situation we're in. So why these as well? Okay, that's kind of the info dumps done. We can all take a rest, and I'm just going to talk about what we can do, and then we can just have a short Q&A. Okay. What you can do, talk more about these issues. I am very, very proud of a family member. I'm not going to disclose which one and embarrass them. But they said, they were presented with someone talking about this situation, this family situation, and someone was like, it's all the man's fault. And she said, well, how do you know that? How do you know that is actually, in this very bad situation, it's all the man doing it? And they didn't. They just assumed it. Sometimes you do know, sometimes you don't. You can always start a men's issues group or society. I planned to do it when I was here, but then dissertation took over. So maybe if someone else could do that, that would be lovely. Support charities for men's issues, Survivors UK, Oh, sorry, on the men's issues, I've always meant to say this. The reason I say about starting a men's issues charity is I've given you a very, very brief tour of just a few problems, yeah? We raised it that we could talk forever just about domestic abuse. You as a feminist society talk about women's issues a lot, and there's a lot of them to get through as well. I know you've got a very full calendar. You can't really give enough justice to both of them in just one society, as far as I'm concerned. And yeah, there's plenty of women's issues to talk about as well, so maybe a dedicated society for men's issues would be better rather than just this one talk, or maybe you've got others planned, I don't know. Support charities, men's issues, Survivors UK, Mankind, Calm, Gender Free DV, all those are pretty great to support. Raise the issue where you can. Write to your MP, I have done this a couple of times. Doesn't always go great. But politicians do talk about men's issues. It does come up. If you read transcripts from Parliament, they do talk about them. They now have an International Men's Day debate in Parliament. Took us a while to get there, caused some problems, but it's there. It's not that they don't talk about them, but as far as I'm concerned, politicians need to know that the people they represent care as well. Maybe I'm a bit naive about politicians, but you do need to actually let your politicians know that you care about this as well. A few success stories. One that we put on this talk, which I'm very, very happy for. I like doing this talk. That we have International Men's Days debates in Parliament now. When I was on YouTube, I eventually quit, retired, whatever. We did a collaboration between Feminist and MRA YouTube channels. So I made a video and then a load of other friends shared it and we built up. And we got about £2,000 from Mankind to keep their hotline running. It only did it for a couple of weeks, but now Mankind have managed to get the funding and they are going until the end of 2017, I think. And then they're going to need to find another source of funding. Against the Odds is a new YouTube channel that started. Some of my old YouTube friends got together and started a MRA feminist collaboration project together, which the reason this is getting filmed is to go up on that. They wanted this up there. And also John Barry's Men's Psychology Conference. So that happened this year, a psychology conference dedicated to men's issues. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend. I was invited, not to talk, just generally to attend. But yeah, that's happening, which was good. It's the first one, as far as I know. And he's trying to push for a special department of the British Psychological Society dedicated to men's psychology. Unfortunately, you can only sign for it if you are yourself a member of the British Psychological Society. So if any of you get psychology degrees or doctorates, please sign. I know it's a few years down the line, but we might still be waiting, who knows. What is being done? Well, the charities I was talking about, the Good Men Project is a great magazine filled with very varied ideas. I just like reading it every now and again. Inside Man as well. Inside Man will accept pretty much anyone writing. So you get things like my article, you get one by a guy who defined as metrosexual, and some by really, really ardent anti-feminists as well. So I quite like Inside Man just for the variety. If you need help, Calm, Mankind, Survivors UK, they do an online chat, Survivors UK, so you can't phone them, but you can do the online chat. And for all students, the Centre of Wellbeing, so if you've ever got a problem, go to them. Thank you. Any questions? I'm going to put that down and have a drink of water. Any questions? Trying to form a question. Should I sit down? Oh, I can't. You've got a recorder. Why weren't you informed about Against All Odds? You've just been informed. I'm sorry. I've been too busy making this and all the other stuff. Yeah.
Do you think that men's health activism and feminism are intrinsically separate?
No.
Do you think that feminism is a specifically women's thing?
I think those are two different questions, though. because feminism can be, you all have your own different ideas of what you think feminism should be. And I know some people who think it should be all about women and just have different groups deal with men's issues. Some people who think it should all be about women because there are no men's issues, and hopefully I've at least convinced you that that position's not tenable. And some who think basically, what's the point in any kind of men's movement because feminism does it all for you? I think they're not intrinsically at odds at each other. Different groups are going to be, but as a general idea, no. You do sometimes have to look at certain feminist theories and go, okay, that's not going to work. Ones which just say that, you know, men can't have problems, which I'm aware are in the minority. Obviously, they're not going to work. It depends on who you're talking to. Like, this is obviously working as far as I can tell. I don't know, maybe one of you are plotting to trip me up as I leave. But I think it's working. Obviously, if there's men's rights activists, and I do know many who are anti-feminists and will never work with a feminist. Against all odds is the opposite of that. That's people working together. And they have their disagreements, I know, but they do talk to each other. So you're never going to be able to talk to people like that. There's one MRA I know who said he doesn't really care about men. He just wants to have a go at feminists. I was like, right, well, you're useless, aren't you? You know, as far as I'm concerned, he's useless for my purposes.
I'd say he wasn't a men's rights activist.
Yeah, I'd say that as well, but I think he changed it later. He just, yeah. No, I don't think they're intrinsically against each other. Some segments of both are always going to be against each other, but...
It depends on the specific group.
Specific groups, specific people,
Yeah.
you know, it's all dependent. Anyone else?
You put up all the stereotypes, and I think they were really important, especially in the first part.
Mm.
Do you want to talk a little about addressing them, or about the stereotypes in particular?
Let's change society. Yeah, let's just change all of society. No, well, as we saw, as a society becomes more equal, these stereotypes, both the hostile and the benevolent, tend to decrease a little. I think they're always going to be there. I think we're always going to have those views of people. Just like you can't really get rid of racist stereotypes entirely, but you can basically manage them. And some of these, you know, you've got to look at the situation people are in as well, like drugs. Some people take drugs recreationally, no problem whatsoever. But those who take drugs to deal with certain problems, well, you've got to look at the problems. You've got to look at the way we handle drug abuse in this country, which is pretty poor. You've got to look at the society around it as well. And some of these are kind of defensive stereotypes. You know, if you view men as predatory, you're going to be more paranoid, but you're also maybe going to put yourself in less dangerous situations. So, communication, I guess, these kind of talks, being aware that you have these kind of stereotypes.
Directly confronting those stereotypes?
Yeah, directly confronting them. I'm not very good at direct confrontation, I'll be very honest. And if you, just from my perspective as a guy, trying to recognise when perhaps some of these are taking over, like, I don't know, emotionally neutered, kind of trying to recognise that in yourself. It's good for anyone to recognise when they're not thinking about their emotions, but, you know, seeing as I talk about this kind of stuff, I try and remain a little bit aware of it. And some of these aren't bad, like smart, that's not bad in itself, that men are stereotyped as smart. The problem is, they're stereotyped as smarter than women. That's the problem. You know, if everyone was stereotyped as smart, that'd be great. This is not a stereotype if we just assume everyone's really clever, I guess. Yeah, so I think we've thrown some ideas around. Sorry, it's not a fully cohesive answer. Generally, stereotype confrontation takes time. It takes society to change, it takes more communication. But as we've seen, as society become more equal, the stereotypes do start going away. Anyone else? At the back?
Do you think that the expression be a man about it or man up, do you think that it will always exist in one form or another, or do you think that in years, decades, or even centuries to come, as genders become more and more equal in terms of each other's expectations or roles in and around society level out, do you think it will just eventually become obsolete and cease to have any meaning?
Yeah. I never hear it nowadays, funnily enough, but I'm aware I'm part of my life goes down a very certain course and I meet certain people and not other people. I think we'll always have an equivalent of basically pull yourself together. And I think more people will use that, pull yourself together. There's not necessarily anything wrong with it depending on the context it's used in. If you've got a guy crying, because, I don't know, he lost his kids and his wife has left him, telling him to man up is a very bad thing to do. If you're just having a bit of a laugh, then yeah, who cares if, I don't know, you want to jump off the top diving board or something and someone says man up. Maybe that's a bad situation to be in, but it's not going to ruin someone's life. I don't know, maybe they're a really bad diver, but you're not going to ruin someone's life. Everything you can say can have a negative connotation. You call someone pretty, depending on the context, depending on the situation, depending on the person, there can be a problem there. Or it could be completely fine, you've just done a nice compliment. You tell someone to man up, it could be a joke, it could be inspiring, it could be absolutely the wrong thing to say. So I think it'll all exist, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, just be careful, I guess. And it shouldn't be a way of dealing with depression, basically, but I don't think that's that controversial. Anyone else? Yeah, you're allowed to.
You put up the list of subjects depending on gender. Do you think that, how much do you think it's an issue? Is that something that you definitely think?
Oh, well, the different subjects, yeah.
For each subject, or do you think? I mean, of course, there's some systematic bias.
Yeah.
But where does that end for you? Where does it start?
To me, it doesn't end with kind of all this kind of quota-based way of looking at things doesn't really appeal to me, because I think you're kind of missing the wider problems. My personal view, basically, this goes into a bit of biopsychology as well, there are some very, very slight differences between general populations of men and women. Vastly overstated, but they do exist. So you'll never quite reach 50-50 on things. But we're talking, 48, 52%. So I think if ever we reach something close to 50-50, it means that there's a lot of good stuff happening in our society, basically. But I wouldn't use it as what we need to do is just pump more men into psychology and more women into engineering, and then all our problems will be solved, because all you've done is basically, I don't know, maybe prohibit male applicants to engineering, because you're not solving the underlying problems in society then. It's kind of, you have to accept the slightly slower route, I think, but that's a more organic change in society. Ultimately, I think if we do have an equal society, it will be about 50-50, barring maybe a few percentage for general population differences. The one big problem is retaining female staff. Even though more women attend university, even though more women attend a lot of these courses, still male-dominated staff.
You mentioned male teachers, and I've been thinking about, and like in primary school, all of my teachers were females.
Yep.
Middle school and high school was kind of equal, but at university, all of my lecturers are men.
Yeah.
And it's interesting.
Yeah, especially at primary school. One of the reports I was reading, you can't be a teacher, you're a man. There's a thing that you can't have female teachers.
I find that interesting.
Yeah.
Both my brothers are primary school teachers.
Yeah. Best primary school teacher I had was a guy, but yeah. Should we start wrapping it up? Any other Q&As? One more? One more? Anyone who hasn't said anything? Anyone who disagrees with me intensely, please. You can write it on a piece of paper and pass it to someone else to read. Yeah, and then you can have a go about me. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. You've been great. Thank you. I can now take this off and sit down. Thank you.